first explosion struck like a hammer from the heavens, tearing through the silence of the Atlantic depths and shaking U-96 so violently that the lights went out. For a moment, no one breathed. Then, in the faint red glow of the emergency lamps, the radioman opened his diary with trembling hands, tracing unsteady lines across the page as another blast rolled through the hall. The steel groaned like a living creature in pain, bending under pressure no human could endure. Around him, men whispered prayers they hadn't said since childhood, while others stared ahead, rigid, as if bracing themselves for what was coming. The captain's voice finally cut through the chaos. It was steady but sharp, as he ordered an emergency dive into deeper water, where survival was more of a gamble than a strategy. Another thunderous detonation followed, closer this time, pushing the air out of the compartment. Dust drifted from the ceiling as gauges flickered and pipes rattled. The boat pitched steeply downward, forcing men to cling to whatever they could find. Sweat rolled down their foreheads, even in the cold, stale air. Every heartbeat felt amplified, echoing through the cramped metal coffin that now seemed far too small. The radioman pressed the pencil harder, documenting not just the violence outside, but the fear tightening inside every man aboard. Somewhere ahead, a young torpedo man muttered that the destroyer above must have found their exact depth. A petty officer shushed him instantly, as if speaking the truth aloud could make the next explosion certain. The captain ordered silence, straining to hear the faint acoustic signatures on the water, his ear pressed to the hull as though it could reveal their fate. But before he could speak again, another depth charge exploded. The shockwave rippled through the boat, knocking several men to their knees. One of the electricians bit down on a curse as a panel sparked dangerously close to his hands. The radioman scribbled the words he feared might be his last. This might be the end. What the crew didn't know was that the convoy we had attacked carried an escort unlike any we'd faced. He paused, feeling the hull tremble. The destroyer's propellers churned above them like a predator circling prey. Another blast followed, closer this time, rattling every bolt and rivet. The air felt thinner. Panic loomed, unspoken but palpable. Then came the moment that changed everything. A final, deeper thud rolled through the water. Not a sound of destruction, but of opportunity. The captain straightened, eyes narrowing. "Hold on," he whispered. "This is our chance." And in the suffocating dark, hope and terror briefly shared the same breath.
They were often seen as the silent hunters of the Atlantic, ghosts beneath the waves. But aboard U-96 lived a group of young men connected more by circumstance than by belief. At the forefront was Kapitänleutnant Heinrich Lehmann-Willenbrock, a commander respected not just for his skill, but also for his remarkable instinct for survival. His calm presence held the crew together through storms, mechanical failures, and the hidden threats of the deep. Alongside him were officers who bore the weight of decisions that could endanger them all, engineers who breathed life into aging machinery, and torpedo experts who knew that a single misfire could ruin the entire mission. Among them was a young radioman, just over 20, whose diary would become the quiet pulse of their story. U-96 itself was a Type WWII submarine, the mainstay of the Kriegsmarine, built for endurance rather than comfort. The cramped steel corridors, the constant smell of oil and metal, and the heavy humidity created an atmosphere as harsh as the ocean they navigated. Every pipe, gauge, and rivet formed part of a delicate system that required total obedience. Yet within this mechanical maze, the men carved out bits of humanity. They shared jokes, whispered memories of home, and enjoyed rare moments of stillness when the ocean allowed for a break. Their public image portrayed them as fearless hunters in the Wolfpack strategy, masters of stealth and precision. But behind the uniformed photographs and grand propaganda, each man dealt with personal fears. They knew every patrol could be their last. A single mistake could plunge them into darkness. The radioman captured these contradictions with surprising honesty, recording nights filled with laughter at the mess table, and others when the silence felt heavier than the sea itself. He noticed how even the most experienced sailors hesitated before a dive, as if recognizing the thin line between survival and oblivion. Despite their training, none were immune to fear. They were young men, many still close to being boys, thrown into a war of endurance where the enemy was not just surface ships, but also isolation, exhaustion, and the unending pressure of the deep. Their bond formed not through ideology, but through shared vulnerability, through the need to trust one another completely in a world where that trust could mean life. Little did they know, the next patrol would test them beyond anything they could imagine, pushing them to face not only the dangers of the Atlantic, but also the limits of their own endurance.
By late 1941, the Battle of the Atlantic had turned into a test of endurance, smarts, and changing technology. German U-boats no longer operated alone. They moved in groups called Wolfpacks. This strategy aimed to overwhelm convoy defenses with relentless nighttime attacks. When a single submarine spotted a convoy, it would shadow the group quietly and send encrypted messages to alert the rest of its pack. Under the cover of darkness, the boats would come together from various angles, firing torpedoes before vanishing beneath the waves. It was a brutal but effective tactic aimed at cutting off Britain by destroying the merchant ships essential for its survival. Each sunk ship was a serious blow to an island dependent on supplies from across the ocean. But by November 1941, things began to change. Allied radar became sharper, aircraft patrols extended deeper into the Atlantic, and escort ships became more aggressive. U-boats that once moved confidently now faced a battlefield increasingly shaped by Allied advancements. Convoys traveled in tighter formations, had better communication systems, and were led by commanders who understood the Wolfpack strategy. The hunters were slowly becoming the hunted, and the sea that once provided cover was becoming dangerous. Within this changing landscape, U-96 received new orders that would determine its fate. High Command directed the boat to a meeting point in the North Atlantic, where Wolfpack Hecht was forming. The goal was simple in theory, but deadly in practice: intercept a major convoy before it could reach the safety of British waters. Failing meant allowing Britain to maintain its war industry. Succeeding could cripple its lifeline. The stakes had never been higher for either side. As U-96 set its course, the crew felt the weight of their mission. The radioman's diary noted the tension spreading through the boat as the men prepared for a confrontation like none they had faced before. Winter at sea showed no mercy. Waves towered over the conning tower, soaking the watch crew as icy spray coated their gear. Inside, men tightened bolts, checked torpedoes, and reviewed procedures carefully. They recognized the strength of the Wolfpack, but they also understood its weaknesses. A single mistake in timing or communication could expose them all. The captain studied intelligence reports, considering the convoy's likely route and the new threats from improved Allied escorts. But what High Command didn't realize was that the Allies were waiting for them. The radioman wrote this with worry, sensing that the mission held unseen risks. Unknown to the crew of U-96, the convoy they were pursuing was shielded by a strong escort group equipped with advanced detection tools and eager commanders ready to confront the feared U-boats. As the boat pressed deeper into the Atlantic, dread quietly settled among the crew. The Wolfpack was gathering, but so were the clouds of a battle that would test every skill they had.
Life aboard U-96 unfolded in continuous twilight. Sunlight was a distant memory, and every breath was tainted with metal, diesel, and sweat. 8 weeks at sea meant being confined in a narrow steel shell. Privacy disappeared, tempers flared, and even basic comfort felt far away. The air grew stale within days. Condensation dripped from the ceiling like cold rain, and oppressive humidity clung to their skin. Men slept in shifts, sharing bunks still warm from others, while some curled between torpedoes or squeezed beside machinery that rumbled around the clock. Sleep provided little peace. Even in dreams, the constant throb of engines and the groaning of pressure haunted them. The radio man captured their misery in his diary with stark honesty. He described the stench that settled over the boat, a mix of unwashed bodies, spoiled food, and oil that seeped into clothing and never faded. The toilet broke down often, turning the tiny space into a hardship few could withstand. Food rations spoiled quickly. Bread molded, sausages turned slimy in the heat, and canned goods became dull. Still, the crew forced themselves to eat, knowing hunger clouded their judgment as certainly as fear. Water was scarce, prioritized for machines over men, so the crew could only wash when they collected seawater. The psychological strain was heavier than the ocean above. Days blended together, and hallucinations crept into tired minds. Some men got they heard voices outside the hull, while others claimed to see flickering shapes in the dim red light. Arguments erupted over small issues, and then faded into uneasy quiet. Yet there were moments of fragile humanity. Officers telling crew jokes, sailors humming old folk songs, and quiet talks about families waiting back home. They sometimes sang to drown out the roar of the engines, and at other times they sat in silence, listening for the faint sound of a destroyer's screws. Fear was a constant companion. The sudden clang of shifting metal could make hearts race, as each man wondered if a depth charge had just missed them. The radio man wrote of nights that felt like a tomb, when the air felt too thick to breathe, and the slightest noise made every head turn sharply. Letters were written in the dim light of a single lamp, filled with longing and resignation. They knew many of those letters would never reach their destination, tucked into pockets that might sink to the ocean floor. Still, the crew persevered. They repaired machines with bleeding fingers, joked through exhaustion, and faced their fears with determination born from necessity. They became a family of survival, bound not by choice, but by the shared understanding that the ocean accepted no weakness. Every man recognized that their struggle was not just against the allies above, but also against the loneliness gnawing at their minds. Then, everything changed. An unexpected signal crackled through the radio.
The message came through the radio room clearly. A large Allied convoy had been spotted crossing the North Atlantic. It was heavily escorted but vulnerable under the cover of night. U-96 changed course immediately, with the engine straining as the submarine raced toward its target. The crew felt a shift in the air. Conversations quieted, movements sharpened, and every man prepared for the dangerous mission ahead. By dusk, the lookout saw faint silhouettes on the horizon. Merchant ships in tight formation, protected by destroyers whose searchlights swept across the waves. The first phase of the hunt had started, and the clock now ticked in nervous heartbeats. As darkness fell, the captain ordered the boat to surface. Night attacks were crucial to Wolfpack's strategy, using moonlight to outline targets while keeping the U-boat nearly hidden against the dark sea. The men moved with focused efficiency. Their actions had been learned through countless drills, but carried the weight of real danger. The torpedo room buzzed with tension as sailors prepared the tubes, checking mechanisms, aligning gyroscopes, and whispering final confirmations. On deck, the wind whipped across the faces of the watch crew, while the ocean sparkled under a pale crescent moon. Every ship ahead represented a lifeline to Britain, and every torpedo loaded into U-96 symbolized the German effort to cut it. Inside, the radio man wrote observations in his diary, confessing a fear he couldn't speak aloud. The escorts were faster now, more aggressive, equipped with technology he didn't fully understand but felt was advancing against them. He noted the uneasy silence in the control room as the captain calculated firing solutions, using slide rules and instinct to determine bearing, speed, and spread. The success of the attack relied on precision. One wrong estimate could reveal their position instantly. As the submarine closed in, the sound of enemy propellers grew louder, vibrating faintly through the hull. The captain examined the convoy with his binoculars, assessing angles and predicting movements. The men trusted his judgment completely, even as each one felt the tightening grip of suspense. The calm ocean masked the violence about to unfold beneath its surface. The Wolfpack strategy required boldness, striking quickly before the escorts could respond. Yet the radio man sensed uncertainty in the captain's stance, as if he weighed more than just tactical choices. Perhaps he questioned whether the old advantages still mattered in a changing war. When the moment arrived, it came without warning. The captain breathed out slowly, lowered his binoculars, and quietly gave the order to prepare for the attack. Torpedo officers communicated commands in steady tones, hiding the fear coursing through their veins. The bow pointed toward the convoy's leading column, lining up for a perfect shot. The distance shrank. The engine slowed. Tension pressed on every man like an invisible hand. Historians still debate whether this decision was bravery or a fatal mistake. The radio man wrote this line carefully, knowing the next minutes would be remembered as more than just ink. For U-96, the hunt had truly begun, and the thin line between success and disaster grew razor-sharp as the convoy approached. The torpedoes left their tubes with a violent shudder that rippled through U-96 like the heartbeat of a beast waking up. Seconds later, distant explosions rolled across the water. They were muffled, but were unmistakable as merchants burst into flames, steel buckled and fuel ignited in towering columns. The crew felt the shockwaves tremble through the hull, each man silently recognizing the brutal efficiency of their weapons. But triumph lasted only a moment. The escorts reacted immediately, engines roaring as they charged toward the spreading debris, determined to crush the prowling hunters below the waves. The captain ordered a crash dive, and the boat plunged back into the dark, leaving the moonlit chaos behind. Inside, the lights flickered wildly as the submarine descended. Men clung to rails, pipes, and each other, while the hull groaned under the sudden pressure change. The radio man scribbled furiously in his diary, trying to capture the terror around him. The deafening clang of valves, shouted orders echoing through steel compartments, and the cold realization that retaliation would come swiftly. The first depth charges detonated moments later. The sound was monstrous, as if giants hammered the ocean itself. The boat lurched violently, knocking men off their feet and sending tools skidding across the floor. Another depth charge exploded closer. Its force slammed into the hull with crushing power. Dust rained from the ceiling. A gauge shattered. Somewhere in the back, a pipe hissed ominously. Engineers rushed toward the leak, hands shaking as they forced tools into place, desperate to stop the trickle of icy seawater creeping inside. The captain demanded silence as he maneuvered the boat through blind darkness, listening for the rhythm of enemy propellers overhead. The escorts circled like predators smelling blood, their sonar pings echoing through the hull with unnerving clarity. More explosions followed, 1, 2, then a relentless barrage that shook the entire submarine. The radio man saw the torpedo officer grip his crucifix, lips moving in a silent prayer. Another sailor pressed his forehead against the bulkhead, eyes squeezed shut as he whispered a promise to his mother. Fear bound them all, but so did loyalty. No one left their posts. The chief engineer shouted updates through the chaos, working to keep the motors alive despite overheating bearings and a dangerously strained battery system. Every second became a fight for endurance. The boat pitched sharply to starboard as the captain made a desperate evasive maneuver. Sweat stung their thighs and hands, mixing with oil as men scrambled to adjust ballast, correct trim, and keep the submarine from surfacing. Another depth charge detonated so close, it warped a section of flooring. A young lookout screamed as a valve burst beside him, spraying cold water across the compartment. Yet the captain's voice remained steady, guiding them deeper into a narrow thermal layer where he hoped the escort's sensors would falter. For a moment, the explosion stopped. The silence felt heavier than the noise that came before it. The men held their breath, listening for any sign of pursuit. Then the propellers returned, closer, faster, merciless. The radio man wrote the words with trembling hands. What happened next defies belief. Because even in the choking dark, something shifted. A depth charge detonated directly above, but instead of breaching the hull, the blast pushed U-96 into a deeper pocket of cold water. The sudden pressure change hid their position just long enough for the escorts to lose their line. The captain seized the moment, ordering a hard turn to slip beneath the ruined merchant ships. Debris rained down from the surface, muffling sonar reflections. It was a narrow escape, a miracle made from chaos. And as U-96 drifted silently through the blackness, the crew realized they had survived the fiercest assault yet, but the night was far from over. The brief silence that followed their escape felt strange, as if the ocean itself was holding its breath. That illusion shattered when a new series of explosions erupted above the submarine, each blast closer than the last. U-96 shook as if caught in a giant's grip, and the captain shouted for an emergency dive. The boat angled downward, creaking in protest as it went beyond its safety limits. Every man aboard understood the danger. Below a certain depth, the sea did not forgive. The radioman gripped the edges of his diary, his pencil shaking as he wrote that the hull now screamed under pressure heavy enough to crush steel. Darkness pressed against the submarine as they slipped deeper, searching for the thermal layer the captain hoped would provide cover. The lights flickered again, and an eerie groaning sound echoed through the compartments, a clear warning that the depth was pushing the boat's limits. Commander Willenbrock remained unnervingly calm, giving orders with steady confidence while sweat ran down his forehead. His instinct and precision were the crew's only shields. The helmsmen carefully adjusted their course, battling both the weight of the water above and the fear tightening inside their chests. More depth charges exploded, sending violent shockwaves that rippled along the hull. A wrench clattered to the floor. A sailor cried out as a support bracket snapped beside him. The oppressive pressure made the steel groan like a tortured animal, and the radio man recorded the moment honestly. He wrote that he could feel the ocean pressing in, that each breath tasted like fear, and that the men spoke only in whispers, as if louder voices might somehow cause the hull to fail. Battery levels dropped dangerously while the electric motors strained to keep silent movement. A single mechanical fault could doom them instantly. The captain ordered silent running, a command that turned the submarine into a drifting shadow. Every man froze in place. No one spoke, coughed, or shifted their weight. Even the sound of metal was banned. The crew listened to the rhythm of the escort's propellers overhead, growing louder as the destroyer closed in on them. When the sonar pings grew stronger, the radioman felt a hollow dread in his chest. The escorts were close, too close, and detection meant annihilation. Then the captain spotted the faint distortion on the depth gauge. They had entered the thermal layer. He signaled for small adjustments, guiding the submarine into the cold water pocket where sound traveled unpredictably. Minutes felt like hours. The destroyer passed directly above them, its propellers churning the water like an executioner's blade. But the sonar abruptly faltered, confused by the thermal shift. It swept left, then right, then drifted away in uncertainty. For the first time in hours, someone exhaled audibly. The radioman wrote the words he feared might be his final line. The crew didn't know if they would ever see the surface again. But hope flickered now. U-96 remained battered, leaking, and dangerously deep, but alive. As the last echo of the destroyer faded, the men realized they had survived the unthinkable. The ocean had tried to claim them, and still they endured.
When dawn finally broke, U-96 made its way to the surface like a wounded animal. The ballast tanks expelled water with a weary shudder, and the submarine rose through the dim blue until the conning tower emerged into the open air. For a long moment, no one moved. The captain listened with his eyes closed, as if waiting for the ocean to confirm that the danger had truly passed. Only when the stillness lasted did he order the hatch opened. The first men to climb out squinted against the pale morning light. They looked like ghosts, with gray faces, uniforms soaked in sweat and diesel. The North Atlantic, which hours earlier had boiled with fire and explosions, now lay unnervingly calm. A gentle swell rolled under the hull, soft as a lullaby. The contrast felt unreal. These waters had tried to kill them, yet now they rested as peaceful as a lake at dawn. But the ocean was not silent. Across the distance came faint cries, human voices, desperate and fading. The remnants of the convoy burned low on the horizon, dark plumes of smoke rising like funeral pyres. No one spoke. The men stood on the deck, staring into the wasteland they had created, each struggling with emotions for which they had no words. Victory and horror mixed in the air, impossible to separate. Below, in the radio compartment, the radioman's hands hovered over his diary. He struggled to start the entry, as if writing might force him to confront feelings he had tucked away during the battle. When he finally put pencil to paper, the words flowed in a hesitant stream. He described the relief of surviving when their fate had seemed sealed just hours earlier, but he also wrote of the guilt that now seeped into that relief, an uncomfortable weight pressing down on him like the ocean had the night before. "We are alive," he wrote, "and others are not. I don't know what to feel. I don't know what I'm allowed to feel." He admitted that part of him wanted to celebrate, to thank God, even to laugh. Another part wanted to hide from the sight of the burning ships and the cries of men he would never see. He confessed that he didn't understand the morality of what they were doing, that perhaps no one truly did. Above deck, the captain finally ordered the area cleared. The engines rumbled to life and U-96 turned away from the smoke and the sinking ships. As the submarine slid toward the open ocean, the cries faded, then vanished entirely, leaving only the quiet and the heavy burden the crew would carry long after the storm had passed.
When U-96 arrived at the Pens in Saint-Nazaire, the reception was everything the men had dreamed of. A band played, flags waved, and families stood behind railings, straining to catch sight of their sons, husbands, and brothers. Officers from the flotilla headquarters waited on the pier, ready with stiff salutes and congratulatory handshakes. Cameras flashed and someone shouted, "Heroes of the Atlantic!" But the men of U-96 stepped off the gangplank like sleepwalkers. They had been at sea for 8 weeks and had lived through hell and steel and darkness. Though the French sun warmed their faces now, it could not melt the cold that had settled deeper within them. Their uniforms were pressed and their boots shined, but their eyes told a different story. Those eyes had watched too much death and carried shadows that celebration could not remove. Onlookers expected excitement, bravado, and tales of glory. Instead, they encountered quiet nods, half smiles, and brief embraces. A few crewmen held their families a little too tightly, as if afraid they might disappear. Others stayed on deck, hesitant to fully join the noise and applause. They had survived, but something inside them had not come back. The radioman held his diary under his arm as he walked down the pier. In the crowd, he spotted his mother's face glowing with relief. He managed to smile for her, but it felt weak, as if it didn't belong to him. His thoughts lingered back in the North Atlantic, haunted by cries they could not forget. Inside the command office, Captain Heinrich Lehmann-Willenbrock received formal recognition for the patrol's success. He accepted it with steady professionalism, but those who knew him well saw the subtle fatigue behind his smile. He had brought his men home, and that was the only victory that mattered to him. A closing narration reveals U-96's larger story. The boat survived multiple patrols after this one, becoming one of the most famous Type WWII submarines of the war. However, in March 1945, just weeks before Germany's surrender, U-96 was destroyed during a British air raid while docked in Wilhelmshaven. There was no patrol, no battle, just fire from above. The submarine that had evaded death so many times finally met its end. The men who sailed her carried their own ghosts long after the crowd stopped cheering. War had not ended when they reached the pier. For many, it never truly ended.
The rediscovery of the radioman's diary does more than shed light on a single patrol. It brings a human voice back to a part of history often overshadowed by statistics, strategies, and steel. For decades, U-boat warfare has been summed up in terms of tonnage sunk, convoys intercepted, and ships lost on both sides. But behind these numbers were young men pushed to their limits, carrying fears they rarely acknowledged and hopes they barely understood. The diary's pages, brittle and yellowed with age, speak not of heroism or bravado, but of honesty. They revealed trembling hands in the dark, whispered prayers before an attack, unexpected laughter between depth charges, and the quiet longing for home that lived beneath every uniform. This story matters because it shows us that history is never one-sided. U-96 was a tool in a brutal strategy, yet the men inside her were not faceless villains. They were people, bound by duty, survival, and the harsh realities of war. The radioman never wrote about ideas or beliefs. He described the creak of the hull at crush depth, the taste of stale bread after weeks at sea, the guilt of hearing sailors in the water, and the fragile friendships formed in fear. His words revealed the true value of conflict, not glory, but the human mind and heart. For modern viewers, his voice acts as a bridge across generations. It reminds us that technology changes, tactics evolve, and geopolitics shift, but the emotional cost of war remains the same. Whether in the steel shadows of a World War II U-boat or the complexities of today's conflicts, ordinary people face moments that shape, scar, or define them. The diary pushes us to look beyond the myths and simplified narratives and confront the truth that suffering is universal, regardless of the uniform worn. What makes this discovery resonate today is its intimacy. The radioman wrote without thinking that the world would ever read his words. He wrote to stay sane, to make sense of his fear, and to hold on to bits of humanity in a place meant to strip that away. In doing so, he created a testament not to victory, but to survival, not to ideology, but to experience. His diary serves as a reminder that remembrance is not about picking sides, it is about honoring the truth. As the documentary ends, the legacy of U-96 transforms from just a tale of battles and patrols. It becomes a reflection on the fragile line between life and death, the burden carried by those who return,
and the silence left by those who do not. The radioman's final entries resonate across time, offering a simple but powerful lesson. In the end, war is less about the nations involved and more about the individuals who endure it. In the silence of his diary, we hear the voices of thousands who never returned.